I've never lived in a haunted house, but my mother did as a teen. Other houses on her street had strange things going on too, but a few homes away from her lived a family. One night, the daughter went to bed with a bad headache. The next day, she was dead. She had passed away from an aneurysm. After her funeral, the family went away to get their minds off the tragedy, until the father asked my uncle, my mom's brother, to check on their pets. My mom and dad, who were dating at the time, went with him. My mother had heard there was a grand piano and she wanted to play it. My dad was studying to be a veterinarian. After entering the house, my uncle and father headed to the basement to see the animals, and my mother went to the piano on the ground floor. She was playing it when she felt something brush her ankles. She thought a cat must have left the basement and walked past her. She kept playing, and then she felt it again. She looked under the piano and saw nothing. When she started again, she felt hands clasp her legs tightly. She dashed to the basement door, called my uncle and father, and waited for them. Back outside, my uncle could tell my mom was rattled and asked what was wrong. She told him what had happened, and he turned white. He told her the daughter who had died used to play a game with her father. When he played the piano, she'd crawl underneath, grab his ankles, and push his feet up and down on the pedals. This is the story of the time an actual murderer tried to kill me, and I survived. It wasn't some hardened criminal, or a scary-looking skinhead, or a badass gangster. It was a little old woman, but she was a legit killer. She'd shot her husband in the chest with a shotgun 2 years prior to me meeting her. She did not do any jail time because she had numerous witnesses that had confirmed her story of self-defense. The rumor around the hood told a different tale, but regardless, she had truly killed a man, and the shotgun that leaned in the corner of her foyer was probably the murder weapon. Anyway, I met this woman at the height of my drug addiction. I'm sober now, going on 6 years, but at the time I did a lot of opioids. My favorites were Percocets. A fellow junkie happily informed me that we had a promising new plug who sold her 70-pill prescriptions each month. Miss Coco. I go to this address the very next day and realize this woman lived only a few streets down from my homegirl Selena. I stopped by her place first to say hi. When she asked me why I was in the neighborhood, I told her I was coming to see Miss Coco, and her expression changed. That's when I learned not only the story of the murder, but a bunch of other crazy stories about shit she had done to people in the hood. Selena begged me to be careful. I'm like, whatever, it's an old woman, I ain't scared. I slide over to the address of this little shotgun house and knocked on the door. She was supposed to be expecting me. The door cracked barely open, and I saw how short and old she was. All I could really see was a slice of her face and one of her bloodshot eyes. She asked my name. I told her, and she opened the door, motioning for me to enter. Right away, I saw the gun leaned in the corner. She told me to follow her, and I finally got a real good look. She was so feeble looking. Not skinny, but short and hunched over, and walked with a cane. Her head was wrapped in a silk bonnet, and she was wearing something like a muumuu. We're in the living room now, and she asked me to sit down. I chose the only empty spot on the couch. The entire house was cluttered, but not dirty. Suddenly, though, an oddly placed rug on otherwise bare floors made me wonder how hard it was to get blood out of wooden floorboards. Did Selena say she actually killed that guy in here? She offered me a drink and a snack. She looked at me with surprisingly kind eyes. What a strange drug deal, I thought, but how sweet of her. I remember thinking Selena was foolish for buying into all the hood tales of how dangerous this woman was. I drank a soda, downed a snack, and purchased her entire script of pain pills. She'd be getting it filled again on the same day next month, she informed me. Okay, great. See you then. I returned on a routine schedule for several months, always drink a soda, always downed a snack, and went happily on my merry, intoxicated way. I even got to know her a bit during my visits. Her diabetes, her kids, how helpful weed was for her pain. I brought her a joint to share here and there. I even helped her move some furniture one day. Never a mention of her late husband, though, and I wasn't going to ask. I had long forgotten any sort of wild ideas about this old, sweet woman possibly snapping at any moment. One summer month, it was my day to go to Miss Coco's. My boy Sean was with me already, so I decided to let him ride along. We show up, go inside, same routine as always. She looked at him somewhat suspiciously, but I told her he was good people and she allowed him in. During our little chat, Sean mentioned something about wanting to see a movie that had just come out. I cannot for the life of me remember which movie. Miss Coco got excited and told us she happened to have a bootleg of that exact movie that we could borrow. She let us look through a giant stack of bootleg, burned DVDs and borrow whatever we wanted. We took 3 of them and she simply asked that we return them when we were done. That night we decided to watch the one Sean had wanted to see, so we popped it into the player at my place. Immediately it was unwatchable. It seriously looked like a cell phone video. You could see people in the theater walking in front of the screen. The guy filming was loudly talking throughout the entire film. Garbage. We laughed about it, assumed the other 2 were just as bad, and watched something else. A few days later, I was going to hang out with Selena, so I figured I'd swing by and return the DVDs to Miss Coco. I tried calling, but she didn't answer. I walked up to the doorstep and knocked, but there was still no answer. I figure, no big deal, I'll just leave him here by the door for her. She had a storm door that had a screen on the top half, and was solid metal on the bottom half. I opened that door, propped the shitty DVDs up against her actual door, and then closed it. That way they couldn't be seen, and they were protected from the weather as well. I go on to Selena's place and don't give it a second thought. Later that night, I'm getting high with my friends, and my phone starts ringing. I'm seriously faded, so I just decided to ignore it. I don't feel like talking. It rings again. And again. Finally, my homie is like, "You gonna answer that?" So I pull out my phone to check it. It was Miss Coco. She never calls me. Ever. Especially not late at night. Having her number in my phone was strictly for the purpose of me calling her on the 12th of each month to announce what time I was coming over. That's it. Today was only the 9th. I thought maybe something bad had happened and she needed help. I called back and she picked up before it even rang one time. She was furious. I mean, absolutely livid. She did not sound like the little old lady whose couch I chilled on. She was extremely pissed about the fact that I had left her DVDs in the door. She lectured me about how a dumbass white person like me just doesn't understand how things work in the hood. Someone could have seen me leave them there and could have come behind me and stolen them. I should have waited until she was home. I was disrespectful and rude and ungrateful. She went on and on. I didn't have an attitude in my voice, and I did apologize, but I also mentioned that even though I appreciated the gesture, the movies were really pretty terrible and not worth watching again. Abruptly, and very eerily, her tone changed. Suddenly she was sweet old Miss Coco again. She told me I was right and she was just a little on edge that night. She apologized for her reaction and told me I was good to her and didn't deserve that. Then, she said, as a matter of fact, she had gotten her script early that month. She picked it up earlier that day. Why don't I come over and get it tonight? Now, any sane, sober person would have immediately noticed the red flags here, but in my infinite knotted out wisdom, I thought Junkie Jesus had performed a miracle on me and that my night was about to get even better. Time to get extra faded, bros. I'll be back with more goodies as soon as possible. I head off down the street to Miss Coco's house. I'm still very, very high. I'm walking up to the house and I see that the DVDs are still there. Miss Coco opens the door before I even get up to the step and tells me to pick up the movies and bring them inside. Her voice was stern, which was unlike her, but she didn't sound crazy like she had on the phone. I bring them into the living room where I always go to sit, and something is just off. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I realize she's still behind me, in the foyer area. She starts telling me the same things she was saying on the phone, but calmly this time. My back is still to her. I don't say a word. I set the DVDs on the side table, and despite being extremely inebriated, finally realize that I'm definitely not here to pick up pills. A temporary sobriety of the survival instinct variety kicked in all at once. Everything just sort of clicked into such a clear, crisp vividness that I'll never forget. I knew she was standing exactly where the shotgun leans. I knew she was in between me and the door. I knew that she wanted to kill me, and I knew she had already had a whole gang of local folk ready to corroborate whatever story she came up with. Every single detail that Selena had described to me that day, that she warned me about Miss Coco, played through my mind in a matter of seconds. I ran. I burst out through the back of the living room, knocking over that stack of bullshit bootleg DVDs as I scrambled past it. I'll be honest, once I had found my way out the back door, I wasn't that scared anymore. It's not like she was going to catch me. I circled back around the tiny house and took off down the street, probably before she even managed to hobble around and look out the front door for me. I never did see if she actually picked up the gun. My back was to her, and I made the decision to run without even turning around, but I just knew it. I felt it. It was a feeling I won't soon forget. The scary part was knowing just how absolutely mind-numbingly high I was and how oblivious I was until the very last second. And that's the story about how I almost was taken out by a crazy little old lady with a shotgun over the world's shittiest bootleg DVDs. Makes you wonder what small infraction her late husband committed. I don't really believe in ghosts, but a few years ago I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Melbourne, Australia. It was my first time living on my own. The apartment block had been built in the 1930s, and I'd been there for a few months when I came home from work one day and went into the bathroom. I saw something strange, a wooden board, which had covered a hole in the ceiling that led to a small attic space, lay fractured in two pieces on the ground. I examined the pieces. The board was an inch thick, and it would have taken Bruce Lee to break it. I thought the landlord had sent someone to work on the attic. I was frozen stiff with fear. Someone is up there for sure, I thought. I emailed pictures to the landlord, asking if anyone had been there, with an undertone of annoyance, since she hadn't warned me ahead of time. Her reply read, "Please call me as soon as you are able to." I called, and she explained that her last two tenants had the same thing happen to them. She promised to replace the board, and she did. A month later, I woke up one night around 4 a.m. My body was covered in goosebumps. It felt like someone was rubbing his or her hands on me. Everything was silent, but then I heard a dragging sound coming from above my bed. It was as if someone was pulling a sack of potatoes. I froze, convinced someone was up there. There is no way an animal could have made that sound. After 5 minutes, I worked up the courage to turn on the light, armed myself with a cricket bat, and walked to the bathroom. That's when I saw the new board covering the hole was broken in two. I felt sick. The dragging sound had stopped, but I heard something else. Whispering. The sound was clear and coming from the attic. It sounded like children's voices, and I could hear one sentence repeated over and over. "It's your turn. It's your turn." I switched on every light in the apartment to make things feel normal. It was 5 a.m. and dark outside. I watched TV to try and unwind, then a fuse blew. My pet budgie, Dexter, whom I had kept in the kitchen, usually never made a sound at night, but he started squawking like he was being strangled. I never heard him make those sorts of noises before. It was like he was screaming. I grabbed my car keys, ran out, sat in my car, and waited there until the sun came up. When I saw people walking their dogs, this comforted me enough to go back in. The front door was open, but I figured I might have forgotten to close it when I ran out. I went to the kitchen to check on Dexter, but he wasn't in his cage. I felt sick again. All my windows were closed, so I looked everywhere inside. When I walked to the bathroom, I heard splashing, and Dexter was half drowned in the toilet. I took him out, washed him, and dried him. I was so confused. At around 8 a.m., I called the landlord and gave her a watered-down version of the night. "Oh, wow, you heard the whispering too," she said. "I stayed in that apartment for another 18 months. I heard the whispering on and off for a few other occasions, and twice the board covering the hole in the ceiling moved. Although I live somewhere else now, the landlord recently called. She said that the new tenants had begged to speak with me about some of the stuff that's been going on there. Forget it. It's their problem now." When I was in 3rd grade, I remember getting called to the front office to be dismissed. I always knew when I would be getting dismissed beforehand, so this caught me completely off guard. Maybe my mom was going to surprise me with a day off? Maybe? Anyway, I get about halfway to the office and my teacher comes up behind me screaming at the top of her lungs to get back into the classroom now. She grabbed my arm super hard, which I understand now as an adult, and dragged me back into the classroom. I thought I was in trouble. She immediately slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, then flipped the lights off. At this point, I'm very, very confused. The classroom phone was lying on her desk instead of being hung up on the wall. She whispers into the phone that I'm officially back into the room and in lockdown. Then, an announcement over the school's intercom informs the entire school that they need to be in lockdown and that all students need to run back to the classrooms. Cue the silent panic. Long story short, some random guy tried to dismiss me from school to kidnap me. We don't know who he was or anything about him. My mother was immediately called to dismiss me after being phoned about the incident. She had to show her license and walk all the way to the classroom to physically walk with me. 3 days after this event, it happened on a Friday, we had full photo name tags for any non-student, aka an adult, who wanted to walk through the office doors. You had to give your license number, scan a copy of your license, take a current pic to be printed on a temp badge, then be cleared to enter the actual building by scanning the photo ID temp badge. It makes me sick to think about it. I now have a 3-year-old daughter myself, who I am slightly nervous about sending to school in a few years. Fortunately, school security is way more amped up than it was back in the 90s. Hey Reddit, I'm a longtime user, but due to the nature of this situation, I decided to use a throwaway. Trigger warning for a baby death, abuse, stalking, etc. Also, apologies if this isn't the right sub. We just need some answers. My girlfriend's mother is a longtime heroin user and has been in and out of jail for my girlfriend's whole life. When she lived with her mother and her mother's husband, she witnessed physical abuse and drug activity. She was forced to move out at a very young age in order to stay alive. She thought her mother was finally clean when her mother announced her pregnancy. After getting over the initial shock, my girlfriend decided to be supportive of her mother since she thought she was clean. That was until her mother overdosed while pregnant. She decided to cut all contact at that point. My girlfriend is also a mandated reporter and last year reported her mother and her mother's husband to the state since she knew it wasn't a safe situation for the baby. The baby died in their house not even a month after birth due to an overdose with signs of physical abuse. My girlfriend's mother was arrested for the murder of her baby and other charges, as well as her husband that was arrested for child endangerment. At first, the judge did not grant either of them bail. Eventually, though, her husband was granted bail, in which he posted. We did not know this until recently, which helped us put some of the pieces together. My girlfriend and I like to sit outside her house in the car and just chat or listen to music. Recently, though, there have been black cars around my girlfriend's house. She also is frequently followed by black cars when she drives me home. It's the same couple of black cars that do this, they're not just random ones. At first we thought we were just paranoid since everyone was still in jail, but when we found out that the husband was out of jail, we began to doubt our insanity. The first major thing happened after my girlfriend and I went out on a dinner date. We got home after dark and sat in her car for about 45 minutes before we noticed the same black car passing by us every few minutes. About 10 minutes after that, a different car drove towards us, flickering its high beams on when it got close enough for us to see who was inside. It swerved into the oncoming lane and I genuinely thought it was going to hit the passenger side of the car. It sped away and we ran inside. After that, we started noticing the black cars more and more. This past Wednesday morning, around 3 a.m.-ish, the same distinct black van that we had been seeing pulled up outside of my house. This was weird because my girlfriend and I live about 30 minutes from each other in 2 separate cities. A man got out of the van and shined a flashlight through my yard, almost scanning it. He shined the flashlight up the window I was sitting at and kept it there for a second. Then walked about 30 feet to an empty driveway and scanned around there for 20 seconds before getting into the van and peeling away. The windows were ice covered and frozen, so I couldn't make out the specifics of the van, but it was very strange. A few nights later, my girlfriend and I spent some time hanging out in the car when we spotted a black van hiding behind another parked car further up the street. We could only see one headlight, but it creeped by us as we sat in the car. My girlfriend lives between 2 dead-end streets. Think of a very blocky U. The van went up the first dead end 4 ways on, and sat for a few minutes before turning around and driving almost into the other lane of traffic to get close to us. It then went up the other dead end and stayed put. We thought it was very weird that the van didn't just back out of the first dead end, instead opting to drive all the way up the narrow street and turn around. After a few minutes, we called a friend and recount the story just to get an extra opinion. While my girlfriend was talking to our friend, I got out of the car to go for a cigarette and to see how far away the van was. I walked up the dead end that the van was on for about 15 feet before getting the worst gut feeling I've ever gotten. Across the street from me was a black mass, which was darker than the darkness around it. I decided to just turn around and rush my girlfriend into the house. Later that night, we heard a bang coming from downstairs, followed by what sounded like a boot. We locked the bedroom door, and I sat against the door with a baseball bat, hoping to barricade it. A few minutes later, we heard a car door slam before the sounds of tires squealing off and a car driving away. Our initial thought was maybe it had come from the TV, but we paused it, and the TV in the next room is never loud enough. When I went downstairs an hour later to get water, there was nothing damaged or missing. We theorized that maybe it was the sound of the front door trying to be opened even though it was deadbolted. My girlfriend's exterior wall doesn't face the road, and we've never heard car sounds before. It is, however, next to a private driveway, and sometimes we'll hear her grandparents' car door close to the neighbors backing out. The next day, I was shoveling the sidewalks at my girlfriend's house, an activity that took about 20 minutes, and I saw the same black Chevy Silverado with mud streaks on the tailgate. It circled the block about 4 times. I was able to see the silhouette of a man driving through the passenger side window, and each time it was the same man and same truck. My girlfriend lives in a small town, and we're able to catalog the neighbors' cars. The black van and truck are abnormal. Our theory is that someone is trying to scare my girlfriend into not testifying, or flat out making sure neither of us have the ability to testify. We really just need more opinions. Are we just paranoid, or is this something that we should actually be worried about? Do you think these are just weird coincidences? My dad used to be an abalone diver as a young man in Victoria. Easy money by the bag if you wanted it enough. Though half the guys that do it act like they're on cocaine most of the time from all the nitrogen in their blood. So it's a dangerous game you can only play for so long. There's a story he told me once, and only when he got drunk on his 50th, about an encounter he had whilst diving with a mate. The water down that part of Australia is thick and black and cold. The kelp is so thick that some people get lost in it and tangle their breather hose, or more often than you'd think, just disappear. Anyway, he's diving off a shelf face about 90 meters, and it's completely black. He said you would just pull yourself along the face, grabbing abalone by feel. The pressure is enormous, and there are great whites swimming around with their mouths open who regularly attack divers or cut air hoses, which, by the time you realize, you're dead. Well, without rambling, he was making his way along this shelf collecting, and felt a nudge on his back. His mate and him always worked in close tandem, so he just assumed it was him and reached out to pull him closer, but as soon as his hand touched it, it just smashed him out of the way and got its tail wrapped around the air hose, which ripped it off the container connected to my dad's mask. So he immediately got his little pin light out that he kept on his dive belt for checking cuts. He sees that the end of the hose is a few meters away, spewing bubbles. The thing that gave me chills is the way he described that in the inky darkness 90 meters down, he could see nothing but the reflection of the bubbles from the hose, and the dark, lifeless eye of the great white behind it. From what I can piece together from the odd story and anecdote, that was the last dive he ever did, recreational or commercial. He's never told anyone except me or one of his brothers, and I'd never dare to tell Mom. I think about this a couple of times a year, and I've looked it up but never find anything similar. This happened a few years ago. One night, my now wife and I were driving back from Sonic. We lived in a very old, very small town in West Texas. It was raining but not heavily, and there were puddles on the ground, wet enough that it would be weird for someone to be walking around. On top of that, there's lots of roads with little or no lighting, so lots of the roads are mostly dark at night. We were driving down one such road when this happened. As my wife and I were driving, I looked to my right and saw what I can only describe to be as a faceless man. Not deformed, but faceless. His face was white, or really all of him looked white. He looked almost like a blur. His arms seemed impossibly long, almost down to the ground, and were moving in just an unnatural way. The arms were swinging back and forth aimlessly, but also very fast. The best I can describe this man's movements is that he looked like he was glitching. We weren't moving fast, probably 25 miles per hour, because we were in a residential area. I looked at him long enough that I had time to wonder what I was looking at before he went out of my view. And for a second, I even wondered if someone was using a weed whacker or doing some yard work. But of course not. It was 9 p.m. and raining. I said nothing to my wife, assuming my eyes had just played a trick on me or something. It was dark. Maybe the rain blurred the window. I don't know. A couple hours later, my wife asked me if I had noticed the man on the side of the road that had no face. Still the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. Anyone know what this might be called? Or is there anyone who's had a similar experience? When I was 11, my mother and I lived with her boyfriend Rick, who I hated. He was occasionally physically abusive to me and was always intimidating. Anyway, when it got super creepy was one rainy Saturday morning. My mom was at work, so it was just me and Rick at home. The phone rang at about 8 a.m. and I jumped out of bed and went to the kitchen to answer it. It was my Little League coach calling to confirm that my baseball game had been rained out. I headed back toward my bedroom, but had to pass Rick's bedroom to get there. As I did, there he stood, 6'2", and buck naked. Not wanting to chat with any grown naked man, I averted my gaze and tried to shoot into my bedroom. As I tried to shut the door, I felt something block it open. Rick had followed me to my room and stuck his foot out to keep me from shutting the door. He stood right beside me, towering over me and asking what that call was. I told him, but he just stood there, 2 feet away, naked and glaring at me for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt more like 5 minutes. He said nothing but stared angrily at me. I was already terrified of him from some violence he had committed against me before, but this was just different. This felt like a strange, sexual intimidation. Very scary for a young boy, and very creepy. He finally turned around and walked away. Nothing like that ever happened again, but I did later learn he had some strange sexual issues. I was left with the feeling that he was sizing me up on a very creepy and unhealthy way. It has stuck with me for almost 35 years now. Amsterdam has always been one of my favorite cities. I generally use it as a convenient port of entry for traveling into Europe. This particular trip was during the holidays in 2018. I was staying near the Van Gogh Museum, and I had just come back from spending Christmas in Haarlem. It was getting late and I decided to go for a walk. I ended up having a late dinner near Leidseplein Square. After dinner, around 11 p.m., I was going to have a sit in the square and meditate for a while. I had a rather deep meditation experience for being in such a busy area. When I had finished, I decided to stroll home. I left the square and headed towards Museumsplein. I crossed the canal heading southwest and turned left, walking on the path near the canal. As I did, I heard some laughter. It sounded malicious and close. I looked all around and I couldn't see anyone around me. It was weird, but having spent a bit of time in the area, I didn't find it too unusual, as sometimes echoes travel down the canals. Not 5 seconds after the laughter, something hit me. It felt like being hit by a blast wave or concussion. It came from the direction of the canal, hitting me on my left side. It almost knocked me from my feet, and at the same time it felt like someone put a taser to the base of my neck on the front left side. My ears were ringing so loudly it was hard to hear anything else. I looked in the direction of the sensation, more startled than afraid. As I did, it hit me again, but maybe with only 40% of the energy of the primary event. I was looking in the direction it came from, and I couldn't see anything. The shock faded and the fear set in. I started to run to the right and cross the street. I got to the Museumsplein, and just as I passed the iconic Amsterdam red letters in the square, it happened 3 more times, one after the other, with maybe only 10% of the energy of the primary event, and in quick succession. There was an art installation after the sign on the left, and there were 3 Italian teens hanging by the sculpture. They seemed to notice or be affected by the events, or they were affected by perceiving me being affected by them. I started to run again and didn't stop until I was at my hotel past the Van Gogh Museum. I've spent a great deal of time looking into possible explanations for these events. It had felt like a blast wave or concussion, but the weirdest thing is that it didn't move any other matter around me. Plants and other objects seemed to be unaffected. When the first blast had happened, I thought it was a terror attack or a bomb that had gone off. It wasn't until the subsequent blasts that I noticed that I seemed to be the only matter affected, except for possibly the Italians in the square. I've looked into possible medical causes, like strokes or pinched nerves, and anything that could shed light towards the event. I do a Google dive every year to see if there's anything similar on the web. The closest explanation yet came 2 years later when Havana syndrome hit the news. Has anyone ever experienced something like this? Could you please share possible explanations? I'm reluctant to say I was attacked by an unseen force, but that is kind of what it feels like. I was in good health, sober, and centered when it happened. I was so shook that the woman at the hotel front desk noticed and asked if I was okay. I tried to explain what had happened without seeming crazy, and she could see how shook I was and seemed very curious. She actually had lifted my email from the reservation and emailed me the next day to check in on me and asked a few questions. Please shine light if you have any light to shine. I used to have a pretty shit job at a casino that got me working some pretty weird hours. Some days I would work a normal 9 to 5, others I would go in at 6 p.m. and not leave until 2 or 3 a.m. It wasn't really a big deal, except by the time in the morning, all the parking spaces around my apartment building would be taken, so I had to park a few blocks away and walk to get to my building. I would park, get my pepper spray and keys in hand, lock my door, and walk the block or two to my building. I never felt like I was in any way unsafe until one night when I found a parking space across the street from my building that happened to be in front of a bar. I pulled into the space and got my keys ready. I noticed the guy smoking in the doorway of the bar, about 5 cars down, but he was looking in the other direction and didn't seem to care that I was there. I got out of the car and was about halfway across the street before he noticed I was a girl, and I heard him yell, "Hey, sweetie!" I ignored him, and that must have pissed him off because he yelled, "Bitch!" I started sprinting to my building when I heard the sound of him running up behind me. The building I lived in at the time had been built a long time ago, and everything was outdated, including the security system. After 10 p.m., the doors would lock automatically, and you would have to put a key in the lock and turn it for the doors to open, and it would take forever. I finally got the door open and had just shut it before he got there and was yanking on the handle and screaming at me. My skin was crawling for a few days after that. I was always an extremely small and sickly child. I looked young for my age, and my family and I lived out of town about 8 miles out, and our little community was next to a highway. The school bus would drop me off 2 blocks away from home. One day, I noticed a red truck following slowly behind me. So slow that I figured that they were just looking for a house or something. I ignored it and walked to the end of my house. That was the end of that. Consistently, this truck would follow slowly behind me. After a couple days of this, I walked into my house. I was always the first one home, and I looked out the window. Inside was an older man and a black lab. He was staring at me, idling inside his truck. Then he just pulled away. I decided enough was enough. I told my parents. Of course, my sister was quick to jump in that I was lying, but my mom thankfully believed me. She drove me to the bus stop the next morning. The red truck was there, across the street at a gas station, pointing toward the bus. I got on the bus and my mom decided to drive around the truck. She described the scene. The man was disheveled and dirty, hunched over in his seat just staring at the bus. His license plates were caked in mud, so she couldn't make them out though. It freaked her out so much she called the police and the school. I went to school and was quickly pulled into the office. The man had been spotted at the school, waiting in his truck. That day I rode the bus home, and this time the truck was parked alongside the street. I would have to walk past this man's driver's side door to get home. I debated, considering running for it. Apparently this man was getting desperate now that he was spotted. A police car showed up and I talked to the policeman. Then they went to go talk to the man themselves. He quickly pulled away from the curb and took off down the highway. I never saw him again, and I don't believe he was ever caught. Because of this experience, I'm extremely guarded and paranoid with my own daughter, and soon her sibling as well. The world is a terrifying place these days, and children go missing so easily. I don't like to think about if I had been grabbed. I wouldn't be here typing this probably. My kids wouldn't exist. I was lucky. Many children aren't. So, stranger with ill intentions, let's not meet. When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off, and she said she would come pick us up in about 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was pretty empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that's about it. We went to the basketball court, and after about 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was completely empty except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't much left to do, and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So we decided to play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we would just stick our heads face down into the water. We did this a couple of times and I was winning, and on our last round I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I had won, but instead it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool anyway, we figured we would get out, get dressed, and go back to the basketball court until my grandmother came and picked us up. We only had an hour left anyway, and the water was freezing. As we got out though, the lifeguard stopped us. She asked if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off first. The sign on the sauna said 18 years or older, so of course we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside, above the door, there was a clock, probably to help make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door, you could clearly see it. She followed us in and went over to the thermometer encased in plastic and unlocked it so she could crank up the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't really think much of it. Both my cousins and I were very short girls, and so we couldn't see the temperature that was printed on the thermometer knob, but I know she was turning up the heat. Then she left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should get out in about 10 or 15 minutes. It was already pretty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing. It felt really nice because I was cold from the pool, but about after 15 minutes, it was starting to get a little bit too hot and my cousin agreed that we should just get out and leave and get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, but it wasn't budging. I thought maybe it was jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening, and then I let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we just sat back down and waited. The room was now getting hotter, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door and shaking and twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead. I don't think that there was any way that she couldn't have noticed or heard two little girls banging and kicking the door and screaming. Now we had been in there about 25 minutes. It was so hot in the sauna that it hurt to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire and my eyes and skin were burning. We sat back down to put our towels over our heads because they were still a little damp and it made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin as she is a couple of years younger than me. I looked at the clock and I saw that we had been in there for 35 minutes now. I got up and walked to the door again and saw the lifeguard still just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming that we wanted out and banging on the door as hard as I could, but still nothing. I was starting to get pretty dizzy, so I went to go sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it around my face to cover my nose, and I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I could still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped a little bit. My cousin was laying face down with the towel over her head, not moving or saying anything, so I nudged her to make sure that she was okay. She was, but I could tell that we really needed to get out of there soon because she seemed to be a bit disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget we were in there, and I thought she would have come back soon, but there was the little voice in my head telling me that maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, a man walked past the door toward the pool, but for some reason, I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire and I felt so dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let into the sauna and came back with the lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and I immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now that for sure she had locked us in there because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, I was trying to shove our way out. As we were going out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back in with it. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh and opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes now before my grandmother was supposed to come pick us up. We were both so shaken by what had just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we finally got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner and I told them the story of what had just happened. They thought I must have been exaggerating and they didn't believe me. I truly think that this woman was trying to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt that I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame, but what was her end game? I'm 21 now, but I think about this interaction all the time, and when I'm in small spaces or I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one truly believes this story, and I get it, it's pretty absurd. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions, but do you think that this could have been some crazy misunderstanding? Or do you think that she really just left us in there to die? And why? In my youth, I did a lot of things that I'm not very proud of today, but I wanted to see other parts of the world, and I knew that I did not have the discipline to be in the Navy, so I got jobs on various ships, working from one place to the next. I liked being out on the ocean quite a bit, but I also really liked visiting different places. However, when I was in Japan, I lost my job on one of the ships. I didn't have much money at the time, and nowhere to really stay in Japan. While I was stranded in Osaka, I was able to get a job on a ship. I wasn't really happy about it though. I mean, the ship was sort of seedy. I don't want to tell you too much about what was going on, but I will let you know that it was a smuggling ship. The conditions on the ship were much different than the other ships I had worked on. The crew were the closest things to pirates that I could have imagined lived in that period of time. But the scariest person on the ship was the captain. He was a surly man who had only one arm. He had a scraggly beard and it almost seemed like he never changed his clothing. I also think that he probably had read Treasure Island one too many times. He was very no-nonsense. He barked orders at people and didn't really seem to care too much for the people who worked for him. I mean, I guess in a way it made sense. The man was already deeply entrenched in a very illegal business, so I guess he was pretty much a god on his own ship. So, the most frightening thing that ever happened to me in my life happened when I was working on that ship. It was a time that made me realize exactly what sort of dangerous situation we were in, and not from the law or any government, from that man. 2 of the crew members had to make a repair on the ship. They were carrying a piece of sheet metal across the deck and carrying it in a very awkward manner, over their heads as opposed by the side. I was about to go over to them and offer some help, but before I had the chance to though, the guy who was carrying it in the front slipped. He lost his grip on the piece of sheet metal and fell forward onto the deck. The guy in the back then naturally stumbled as well and lost his grip. The piece of sheet metal then slid forward and sliced into the neck of the crew member in the front, halfway decapitating him. The second crewman jumped back from the sheet metal, and his nearly decapitated partner. He began screaming as other crewmen came up to the scene. The captain then made his way on deck, obviously alerted by the commotion going on. He walked up to the 2 crewmen and looked down at them. The nearly decapitated man wasn't dead though. He was convulsing and bleeding all over the place. The captain reached into his jacket and pulled out his revolver. He then shot the almost headless man twice, putting him out of his misery. When this happened, I immediately thought that the captain was being merciful. Could I possibly have been wrong about him? But while this thought was going through my head, something happened that brought me back to my original opinion of him. He took the gun, shot and killed the crew member who was carrying the back of the piece of sheet metal too. The man fell down dead. The captain made us clean up the bodies and take up the sheet metal to finish the repair. The entire rest of the trip to Hong Kong, I was terrified. I mean, to think that this man was heartless enough to kill someone for making a mistake, I was walking on eggshells the entire time. When we got to the port, I decided I'd rather be stranded and homeless in Hong Kong than go back to that ship. I didn't feel safe until it left port. So, my dad died 5 years ago. It was a freak car accident while he and my older brother were driving home from some sports event they had gone to. My dad was larger than life in every sense of the word. He was 6 feet 8 inches tall, covered in tattoos, and had this laugh that I swear you could hear across the country. He and his twin brother, they were identical, played so many pranks on us while growing up that we sort of just got used to it. That has not changed. Only now, dear Dad has the final laugh. The night of his funeral, my uncle and I were sitting together in the backyard. My uncle was telling stories about Dad and some of their wild teenage years, and I remember so badly wanting to hug my dad. All of a sudden, my uncle and I hear the unmistakable sound of my dad laughing, followed by the back door slamming shut. My uncle and I stared at each other, wide-eyed, and then burst into laughter ourselves, because yeah, that's my dad for you. The door, in case you were wondering, turned out to be locked, from the inside. My uncle and I were the only ones home at the time outside of my Rottweiler, Beast, who could not lock deadbolts, for your information, and it took an hour for us to find the spare key. He's continued to prank us over the years. Our keys go missing, your phone will start blaring his favorite song at 3 a.m. out of nowhere, or you'll wake up to the sound of my dog growling that distinctive rowdy rumble that he only ever used while playing with my dad. His laughter is always heard, as well as the scent of Old Spice, his favorite cologne. We miss him every day, but he always manages to remind us that he gets the last laugh nowadays. I was 11 and living in the States. My parents and I lived in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. One day, my dad noticed a lawn chair had been dragged through from the outer back garden to the front of my parents' window. The ceiling of the window had almost completely been removed. Basically, someone had meticulously taken the time to take the ceiling off the window in order to pop it out. It turns out that the week prior, a neighbor's house had been broken into, so we chalked it up to someone trying to steal our shit. Over the next month, things like this kept happening until eventually my mother was being driven so crazy by the idea of someone being this desperate and not getting caught that she ended up staying in the guest room near the front of the house with a golf club handy. The night we caught the fucker is still so vivid. I was up late watching cartoons, as a lot of kids did when they were my age. When my dog started growling so low and so deep, I started to freak the fuck out. I never heard something so menacing before, and I instantly knew that something was wrong. Every hair on my body stood up. He was staring straight ahead at my window where the blinds were drawn, but it was as if he could see someone right through them. Next thing I know, I hear my mom scream at the top of her lungs, "Caught you now, fucker!" As any smart 11-year-old would, I ran out of the room as quick as lightning to see my mother busting out the front door and chasing this asshole down our little suburban street with a golf club. Obviously, the guy was too quick and got away. The police were called, and within 20 minutes, the guy was in the back of the police cruiser. My mom was called out to identify him, as she confirmed he was the right guy. The officer, who had entered his name into whatever system they used, turned to his colleague and said, "Registered sex offender on parole." I was old enough to know what that meant. The next day, my mom did her research and found this guy's name and history. It turns out he was in jail for previously a 12-year-old girl. The guy wasn't just trying to steal our possessions, he was a sick fucking child molester. She later spoke to a friend who lived 3 streets away from us. It turns out she'd been given the piece of paper that said he moved into their vicinity. The entire experience is quite surreal to me. All those what-ifs hung around for a while, but we didn't let the bad vibes get to us too much knowing this guy had been thrown back in jail. My family has around 360 acres in northern Oklahoma that has been in our family since the land rush. Growing up, the family would meet there for Thanksgiving and Christmas, but as the family expanded, it was quickly outgrown. Nowadays, I'm about the only person that goes there, and I usually go there regularly to train with my firearms. I went there earlier this year, actually, and had an experience that shook me so badly that I haven't spoken about it until recently, and will never go back there alone again. I arrived around 2 p.m. and set up my targets, but something felt off. I use an electronic headset for hearing protection that also amplifies ambient noise, and I noticed that everything seemed to just stop. No wind, no bugs, no birds, nothing. Just complete and total silence, which is very unusual for that area. I run my normal drills, and as the sun starts to set, things just get stranger. There are odd smells, like a dirty litter box, body odor, that started coming around, and I noticed that the coyotes were crossing the field west of me, almost as if they were consciously avoiding entering the woods nearby. Then I started hearing interference coming over my headset, and what sounded like disembodied voices speaking in an undiscernible language that I couldn't hear with the naked ear. Now I'm starting to worry. I start gathering my things, and I hear what sounds like a woman's blood-curdling screams coming from the woods. I've heard mountain lions and bobcats squaring off, which we do have on the property, but this sound was neither of those things. Around the same time, I got what I can only describe as a nauseating, omnidirectional feeling of being watched, shortly followed by very distinct footsteps trudging through the foliage in the tree line, approximately 30 yards from my position. I've been an avid hunter since childhood and familiar with noises in the woods, and the cadence of the footsteps were indicative of a large, bipedal creature, oddly human-like. Very concerning, considering I'm in the middle of a large swath of property that's 25 miles from the nearest populated area. I then pull my phone out to take video, and I start scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Standing behind a tree at the edge of the tree line was a tall, black silhouette with spindly limbs and a pale face, looking directly at me. I managed to capture a great still image of it from the video that I will try to find and attach. I quickly grabbed my range bag and made a run towards my truck. I get about 50 yards from the truck, and the light post on our property, one that's been hooked up to the county power line and has never turned off in 20 years, cuts off suddenly. Now I'm blindly running in the direction I believe my truck is in while I hit the unlock button on my fob to find the lights. I get in my truck quickly, speed off, and as I'm watching in the rear view, the light post turns back on. I apologize for the long post, but I'm finally ready to get this out into the open for interpretation. I tend to think of myself as a rational person that doesn't necessarily believe in the woo kind of stuff, although my mother described me as being sensitive and somewhat gravitated towards energies as a child, hence why I found paranormal to ask. I was doing everything I could to rationalize or come up with a reasonable explanation for the things I was experiencing, but I have no explanation. The kind of fear this experience put into me was unlike any fear I had ever felt before. I was visiting a friend who lives in a community with a main road that leads back into the mountains and an abandoned mining town nearby. I was parked with my friend on that road right at the point where it turned from a well-lit, regular suburban road into a dark, winding mountain road. There was a gate right behind our car, and you could see the reflective sign illuminated from the brake lights of the car. We're just talking and drinking coffee, and generally not feeling too out of place or anything. We were parked under the last street light before darkness on a road perpendicular to that gate. Out of nowhere, my friend looks in the rearview mirror, and his eyes go wide. He slams on the gas and we speed off. He's breathing hard and obviously scared. I'm screaming at him to tell me what the fuck just happened, and he says this. By chance, he pressed the brake lights, which illuminated more of the dark surroundings than the normal running lights of the back of his car. This caused him to notice that when he glanced in the rearview mirror, a full-grown man in what he described as large boots and a dirty, dark, thick jacket and dirty pants was in a full-on sprint towards our car, and so my friend sped out of there as quick as he could. There were always stories of what goes down in that abandoned mining town. A lot of movies are filmed there, and people can visit the town, and a ranger lives there. Some people say occult shit goes on there. People have been found murdered and robbed down along that road. And evidence of cult practices also happen every once in a while, according to the people who live there. When my friend was telling me what he had seen, all I could think of was that guy grabbing us, robbing us, and murdering us. He would throw our bodies in the thick foliage that covers so much of the surrounding area and be on his way. Just as I was finished thinking that thought, I looked over and my door was unlocked. I'll start this by saying I'm a 29-year-old female from a small town in northern Tennessee. The kind where everyone knows everyone, and the kind where you have to drive 30 minutes to an hour to a job that pays a living wage. So, when my dad started his new job around 9 years ago, he found out he was working at the same place as a friend he knew growing up, Barry. I'll also tell you that I was bullied a lot growing up, so I took compliments as a joke mostly. So, when I first met Barry, he would compliment me and tell me how pretty I was. I was 20 at the time, and I always thanked him for the kind words, even if I didn't believe them. As time went on, the complaints got more intense. He would say that he loved to be with a woman of my size. I always laughed it off and never said anything. This went on at company picnics and holiday parties I went to my dad with for about 4 years. Then I got a job with the same company, in the same department as Barry. Things were okay for the 3 months he trained me. He still complimented me daily and I thanked him for the compliments. After my training though, I went to the night shift and only saw him for the 30 minutes of overlap per shift. Then, 7 months into the job, my boyfriend and I broke up. Barry was sympathetic at first, then became a different person. His compliments became more focused on my body and not my face. He would stare at certain body parts while speaking to me and cock his head to the side while standing behind me if I bent down to pick something up. As a woman in a prominently male work environment, I was used to being stared at, but this was excessive. When I became single, he would ask me about my sexual history, my preferences in the bedroom, if I'd be with a man of his age, or a man of his size, which was about 5 foot, and he was over 300 pounds. He'd become frustrated when I told him no. Declining everything he asked me never stopped him though. He just upped his game. He started talking about me and my body to other people at work and asking them questions about me, or trying to get them to ask me questions he wanted answers to. He did this numerous times to my best friend, who we'll call Jay for privacy reasons. Well, luckily for me, Jay just so happened to have a massive crush on me. He never do anything Barry asked of him, and he always told me everything Barry said or asked. This continued on for about another 8 months, and then Barry came to the night shift, so my 30 minutes with him became 8 hours. He would start telling me all about his sexual history, unprompted. The questions, comments, and staring never stopped. To give you all a small example, this man asked me if he had won the lottery, would I sleep with him for money. I said no, of course. He offered me $1,000 one time to have sex with him, and I still said no. I told him there was no amount of money in the world that would make me sleep with him. He got mad at that. He asked for nude pictures, which I still said no to. He'd ask Jay to try to sleep with me and take pictures and videos, and he'd also say no. This all led to me being consistently stressed out and always looking over my shoulder to see if he was staring at me when I had to bend over to pick something up or if I had to reach for something. I'm a very petite woman and all my work clothes at the time were about 2 sizes too large, so you couldn't see my body shape at all. I did that to try to make him stop staring though, but it didn't matter. He still did. I stopped talking to him completely. I stopped being in his vicinity, but he continued to pursue. His comments were just to other people in the building, mainly Jay. It came to a breaking point one week when my supervisor told me that my department had to work one weekend, alone, just Barry and myself on our shift. I ended up begging him not to make me come in. I told him I would call out and take a point, or whatever I had to do. I told him how scared I was to be alone with that man. I ended up saying no man should be alone in a building this size with a woman, period. He actually listened and canceled the overtime. He made sure I was never alone with Barry without a third person around either. I finally broke down and told HR about it all, but that turned out to be a waste of time. It continued for 6 more months, but thankfully I was on medical leave for surgery for 2 of those months. Then, in November of last year, the right person on my shift heard me crying and complaining to Jay about everything before going home one night, and they complained to HR on my behalf. HR finally opened an investigation. They asked me a ton of questions and my answers filled up 2 notebook pages front and back of just the comments and questions from him over 3 years. They asked Jay a ton of questions too, as well as a few other people who had worked around us, and 3 days later, he was finally let go for harassment. He threatened me the day that they put him on suspension for the investigation, and he was banned from the company property unless he wanted to be arrested. I filed a no-contact order against him and I haven't heard from him in over a year. Jay finally told me that Barry had admitted to him at one point shortly before he was let go that if he ever got me alone, he was going to me and do ungodly things to me and just leave my body somewhere. So I'm extremely grateful to my supervisor for not letting that happen to me. I had to type this out twice to get my thoughts in order, but the thing that bothers me the most about it all is that Barry had a daughter a year younger than me, and she had nothing to do with him when I knew him. I can't help but wonder what abuse he possibly put her through growing up. It has been over a year since this all came to an end. I'm no longer scared at work, I'm no longer on edge or stressed out, and I'm not living in those baggy-ass clothes anymore. But as long as Barry is living and breathing in my hometown, I will not live there. And he's made a lot of enemies in that small town because of this. That happens in small towns when your parents know everyone, including the sheriff. Oh, and about Jay, his massive crush paid off and we're now dating. I've never felt safer with anyone in my life. So Barry, the pervert who made my work life hell for 3 years, let's never meet again. And to any other girl or woman who is being harassed at work, do not be afraid to speak up. I promise you it's worth it to tell someone. "15 years ago, I was on a 4-person dive. There were 2 novices, me with 80-ish dives, and the dive leader. We swam in a diamond shape, me bringing up the rear. But one of the novices was all over the place with a camera, burning through his air and swimming up a storm as it were. He lost grip on this shiny new camera and it zipped upwards, got caught in his snorkel, but he couldn't see it. So he kicked out hard for the surface thinking, I assumed, to chase down his camera and went right by me upwards. I grabbed his fin and hauled him down. I signaled to him to stop and calm down. I untangled his camera and handed it to him. Only he didn't move. Instead, his regulator fell out of his mouth, his eyes wide, but unresponsive. I stuffed his reg back in, and unsure what to do, looked for the dive master, but he was gone. For whatever reason, I couldn't reach my tank banger while holding on to the diver and his leg. I started to panic, so I decided to take him up quickly. He had epilepsy. I found this out at about 20 meters on our way up as he started to fit. He got caught up in my gear and kicked my inflator hose from my BCD, and I started venting air. I honestly don't remember much of the next minutes, but I do remember letting him go and watching him slipping below me as air bubbles from my inflator hose rushed upward. The next thing I do remember is this constant beeping noise from my wrist. It was a cheap dive computer, but it had a depth alarm, which roused me from my panic as I dipped past 35 meters. My inflator was back in my BCD and I still had air, but there was no one else around. I started swimming up slowly, in shock I think, when suddenly the dive leader went past me in a blast of current. He grabbed me as he went and hauled me up topside. I was relieved to see he had the epileptic novice diver in tow too. On the boat, they called up a rescue boat to come out and meet us. He was in decompression for a couple of days, I think, but he was fine. I know this because 4 days later, they caught him about to dive again at a different resort. I got air trapped in the pipe between my ear and throat, which was painful and gave us a scare, but ultimately I was fine. The year 2001 marked the 60th anniversary of the sinking of the British HMS Hood and the German battleship the Bismarck. But 1941 was a faithful year for countless other ships that were lost at sea, including the SS Britannia, on which I happened to be a passenger. At the beginning of 1941, I was in Cornwall working in a small team providing power for a new station for cable and wireless being built in 2 tunnels in Porthcurno. It was there that I was offered an extremely well-paying job that involved aiding in the construction of Tehran University, all the way over in Iran. So in March of that year, I left the team to begin the journey that would take me from Britain to Bombay in India, and then on to Basra in Iraq for the land journey to the Iranian capital. I had no idea that I would never make it that far. My wife saw me off from Euston Station in London. As there was a war on, I did not say I was embarking for Liverpool, as this would have clued her into the perilous nature of the voyage and worried her immensely. But she told me later that she saw it on the side of the train as I left. The SS Britannia was used as a troop ship, and there were a lot of Navy, Army, and RAF personnel on board. But luckily for me, I was a first-class passenger. We sailed from Liverpool on the 11th of March 1941, bound for India, via Sierra Leone and South Africa. We had an anti-submarine escort consisting of 3 destroyers and an armed merchant cruiser. The destroyers were stationed one ahead and one each to port and starboard of the convoy. The armed merchant cruiser was a large passenger liner that acted as our rear guard. I jotted down details of my journey, including my expenses, in a small diary that I still have. The ship rolled quite a lot to start with, and I was seasick for a few days. But once the sea had calmed down a bit, I found the voyage much more pleasant. Then one day, I found that the Britannia had become separated from its armed escorts. They were nowhere to be seen. But we all figured we were safe, as we thought that we were sailing too fast for the U-boats to catch up and attack. It was a Tuesday morning, the 25th of March, 1941. I had just taken a morning bath and was lying on my bunk, trying to cool down. Never had I ventured outside of England before, and I must admit I was having a terrible time adjusting to the heat. Suddenly, a series of huge booming sounds shattered the tranquility of the morning at sea. I looked out my porthole, and splashes in the water were everywhere. Something was falling into the water around the ship. I threw some clothes on quickly and made my way over to the starboard side. That's when I heard the tannoy announcement. A voice echoed around the ship from the small, tiny speakers located on each deck. I'll never forget how terrified I was when I had heard we had come under attack from a German raiding vessel. My fellow passengers were panicking as the military personnel on board began to rush into action, screaming at us to take cover away from the outward-facing bulkheads. As we cowered under tables and prayed for our safety, we could hear the whistling of enemy shells as they flew over the ship. It was a sound I still hear in my nightmares. Our civilian liner had been reinforced with a small gun at the rear of the ship, and it brought us hope to hear them returning fire for a moment. But when the ship rocked under the force of a direct hit, our gun fired no more. We later heard that they had taken full force of the incoming shell, with the entire gun crew killed in an instant. I can remember one specific officer, Officer Rowlandson, racing to and fro, carrying the wounded to the first aid post, with more and more blood staining his uniform with every trip he made. I thought very highly of that man. After another devastating hit from the German warship, there was another announcement over the ship's tannoy, ordering us to abandon ship. We found some of the lifeboats damaged when we arrived on deck, which was very worrying, but we still managed to find one intact boat on the starboard aft. I inflated my life jacket, threw my overcoat from the lifeboat, then climbed down and got in. In theory, it was supposed to be women first, followed by first-class passengers. In reality, it was every man for himself. There were too many people climbing down the ladder, and some of the crew were jumping overboard. We were forced to lower the lifeboat early to prevent it being dragged down with the sinking vessel, so many of the crew had to climb down the ropes to reach safety. Some slipped and scorched their hands, causing horrific blistering to their palms and fingers. 2 men were still climbing down the rope as we began to push the lifeboat away from the burning ship. The terror in their eyes was something I'll never forget. They must have thought that they were doomed. All the occupants of the lifeboat called out to them to jump into the water and swim to us. Thank God we waited for them, as one of the men was a Sri Lankan doctor by the name of Das Gupta. May God bless him, for he treated the injured as best as he could. As we rowed away from the burning wreck of the Britannia, we watched as the German raiding ship closed in for the kill. She was flying the swastika, and my heart burned with hatred as she fired shells below the waterline and sent the Britannia to the bottom of the ocean. After 2 days at sea, we found a waterlogged boat with 4 men in it. It suddenly tipped over and they managed to turn it over again and got back in. This happened 2 or 3 more times, and the commander finally agreed to take them on board. The days at sea did affect some people. After a few days, one man put on his overcoat and threw himself overboard. He had lost his mind from the stress of the whole affair. The commander did turn around and pick him up, but it was too late. His heavy clothing had dragged him down into the briny depths. We had sharks with us virtually all the time. They could smell the blood from the wounded and circled us with their fins protruding from the water. It was nerve-wracking. They swam right up next to the boat often, and sometimes I could see their dead eyes staring up at us as they did. It was horrible thinking that certain death was only a few feet away at any given moment. After a few days without washing or access to toilets, 1 or 2 people suggested that we have to swim. They put oars across to hold onto, and a couple at a time went over. We were told to be alert, and looking back, we must have been mad. I went in, but I didn't swim. As soon as I did so, we were scared by a pod of whales which had these great whacking fins. The sharks were the worst, but the sheer size of these whales was something to behold. They could have smashed our lifeboats to smithereens with one flick of their tails. I learned later that Officer Rollinson was picked up off a raft by the Cabo de Hornos, a Spanish vessel, and he and a French baroness who was a passenger persuaded the captain to continue searching. On Saturday the 29th of March, we saw the Cabo de Hornos lit up and put up a flare that was spotted by a lookout. We rowed towards the ship, which in turn made for our original position. When we met up, the lifeboat was going up and down with the swell. We climbed the rope ladder, but we flopped when we got on the deck and had to be carried to tables. We really needed some water as it had been greatly rationed in the lifeboat. They then came around with sandwiches, but took them away when we had one each. It took a week or so to recover from that experience, which was the worst of the war for me. But I thank God every single day that I survived, as there were many poor souls who did not. For 12 years, I've worked as an actor for a local haunted house attraction. It's a lot of fun, as I get to play a variety of horror characters and act out different scenes. While the tours we put on are certainly fake, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that isn't. I should start off by explaining that the building we do this out of is extremely old and was once an elementary school. We gutted the section of the building that was classrooms and constructed it to what we needed it to be. This is when we actually started having weird experiences. There's plenty of activity that can be shrugged off, such as feeling watched or hearing footsteps running in areas that there is no one. Then there are the things that are not so easily disregarded. Such as one evening, a member was working on hooking up our sound system by himself. He had not even hooked up the large speakers yet when he started hearing a loud, deep growl that came booming through them. This terrified him so much he ran out of the building. It would not go back in even after lockup until another member came down in to go with him. He never worked alone in that building again. Other activity seems playful and childlike, such as hearing small giggles and whispering in the halls and in the rooms that are empty, things being moved from where we last placed them, all that stuff. One year, I was in a rocking chair that I would jump out of as a group came through. The thing about the rocking chair is that it was more like a glider, and it was broken. I would have to use a lot of force to get the chair to rock backwards at all. It was right before showtime, and I was sitting in this broken chair getting mentally pumped for the night ahead. I was completely alone when I felt someone grab onto the back of the chair and harshly pull it backwards. I felt myself flying backwards with the chair and honestly thought I would flip out of it. Thankfully, this did not happen, and as soon as I stabled myself, I jerked to see who had done this. The room I was in was large, and no one could get out of this room without me seeing them run away in a split second. There was absolutely no one there, and I was suddenly covered in goosebumps. No one was even in the area around my room at the time. Later that same night, the lights were off. My strobe was on, and a group had just left my room when I noticed a small figure in the far right corner of the room. It looked like a small child crouching down looking my way, and I was immediately worried that a child had been left behind from the previous group. As I headed towards the figure to ask if they were okay, the strobe flashed and the figure was completely gone. This same year, but different night, I was again sitting in my chair waiting for the next group when someone or something growled right into my ear. It was so loud that it caused my ear to ring, and when I turned to see what it was, there was nothing there but an empty room. I changed rooms the next year and did not experience as much creepy phenomenon. There's not much history I've been able to find out about the building, but I'm so curious as to what could be causing all this weirdness. This is only a tiny bit of what has been experienced over the years working there, and I don't feel it will be stopping anytime soon. I was dating a girl for a while, and despite living and working on the opposite side of town, she'd always be near this one neighborhood coffee shop that I frequented, so I'd randomly run into her there and ask what brought her to that neck of the woods. She'd usually reply, grabbing some coffee, or, I had a hunch you'd be here and wanted to say hi. One day, she up and moves out of the state with zero warning. She tells me that we just aren't dating anymore. I was confused, but it was casual, so while it sucked, I just thought, oh, she probably had some family emergency or something and didn't want to tell me. A few weeks later on her Snapchat, I see that she's making absolute stacks in San Diego and is always wearing the same uniform in these pictures. I was a bit confused, but didn't think much of it. I started dating this other chick who frequented the aforementioned coffee shop, and after a month or two of dating, the first chick comes back and starts hanging out with her a bunch around the same neighborhood the coffee shop was in. A week later, both of them are moving to San Diego and want me to come with them, live with them, and work where they work. Something just felt extremely fishy, so I said no, and off they went. Eventually, a picture got posted with both of them in it, in front of a very strange but very instantly familiar building, the HQ of the Church of Scientology. The reason the original chick was always in that neighborhood is because Kitty Corner from the coffee shop was the local chapter of the Church of Scientology. She got pretty ingrained in the church and moved to San Diego to work for them, then came back to recruit gullible people to come back with her. And that's the story of how I lost 2 girlfriends to the Church of Scientology, and was none the wiser. Definitely glad I dodged that bullet. This occurred over 20 years ago, but is still fresh in my mind. My son was born early at 32 weeks. We were lucky, and he only had a few issues, and we were able to bring him home a month after he was born. He came home on oxygen and caffeine due to bradycardia. Once we were home, strange things began to happen. The cat refused to go into his room, and before he was born, I was forever removing said cat from his room. Our dog would sit at the bottom of the stairs and tilt his head as if he was listening to something. I would be changing his diaper and start talking as I thought his dad had just come into the room, only to turn around and find out I was alone. A friend had given him a peekaboo Big Bird toy that would say peekaboo when you covered and then uncovered its eyes. This toy would go off all the time, even after I put it into its box in the closet. I often felt I was not alone in that house. My parents had given us an Angel Care baby monitor as a gift. This had a pad that was placed under the mattress and an alarm that would sound if it did not detect any movement after a certain amount of time. As our son was tiny, only 5 pounds when he came home, this alarm would go off often. I would wake up, walk into his room, turn it off, and check on him. He was always fine, and I never felt that it was anything but the fact he was so tiny that the pad didn't pick up his breathing. During this time, I would often dream of a woman I found in his room. I never saw her directly, but would dream I saw the shadow of a woman with long hair standing and reaching into his crib. The dreams never scared me, but I did find them very odd, but comforting at the same time. I can't remember how long he had been home at this time, but it was at least a month. He was still on oxygen and still on caffeine. Our bed was to the left of our bedroom door, and I slept on the right-hand side next to the door, and my husband slept on the left-hand side. I was asleep and was woken up by being shaken roughly on the door side of the bed. I woke up and looked over at my husband and said, "Why are you shaking me?" only to realize he was completely asleep and on the wrong side to have shaken me. I immediately jumped up and ran to my son's room. I flipped the light on, something I had never done at this point, and heard a gasp from the crib. Often when babies spontaneously stop breathing, you just have to startle them to begin again. I truly believe that he had stopped breathing, and my turning on the light startled him into breathing again. After this episode, the dreams and strange occurrences with the pets and toy continued, until my son came off the oxygen and caffeine, that is. Once that happened, the odd occurrences just stopped. The pets stopped acting weird, and the Big Bird toy never went off on its own again. I believe that someone came home with him to keep him safe. The feeling I got from my dreams was it was a young woman, maybe in her early to mid-20s, and indigenous. I'm Canadian. I will always be grateful for them watching over him and shaking me awake that night so I could startle my son into breathing again. I left the store and it soon became obvious something was wrong with my car. I pulled into the Walmart parking lot I was by and, yep, flat tire on the front left side. My rather pregnant wife and 3-year-old daughter get out. It was really hot. I ended up getting the crappy scissor jack that came with the car, and I was about to get started when my brother-in-law stopped to see if we needed anything. So I said, maybe let your sister and niece sit in the car while I change the tire. I loosed the lug nuts, jacked the car up, pulled the lug nuts off, and the tire is a little stuck. I lay down partially under the car to pull on the tire. The next thing I hear is my brother-in-law shouting, "Look out!" So I just roll away from the car, and the very next thing I hear is crunching metal. The crappy jack had snapped in half, dropping the car all the way to the ground where my arm and shoulder have been like 1 second earlier. There was no damage done to me, but I had to walk the adrenaline rush off for the next few minutes after that. Fortunately, we had AAA, so they sent a guy to come fix it. The tow truck driver said he'd seen those cheap jacks snap a bunch of times before. So, if the only jack you have for your car is the crappy screw-type jack, please buy another one, please. I do not expect to come that close to getting injured and not have anything happen twice in one lifetime. I like the fog. I always have, but the fog that I like is the fog on land, not on the ocean. There's little more scary and confusing than a thick fog when you're out at sea. I have a boat that I like to take out on the ocean as often as I can. It's a small boat, but it's got a kitchen, small dining family room, and cots to sleep on. Very often, me and a couple of my friends will go out and spend some time on the ocean. Although I have always kept very close watch on the weather can always be unpredictable. We had been out for a couple of nights and I made a really foolish navigation error. I really hadn't realized it at the time because we were having some beer and I was just trying to relax. But one of my buddies noticed something and pointed it out to me. I turned and looked and was immediately alarmed. We were moving towards what appeared to be really thick fog, or more likely, it was also moving towards us, and very quickly. Now this is where my complete stupidity kicked in. I had never actually been through a fog on the ocean before. I actually like when it's foggy on land, like I said. There's something about the creepiness of the atmosphere, especially when it's really thick. My friends, being as stupid as I was, thought it would be quite the adventure to steer into the fog and see what it was like. I'd like to think that if we were all sober at the time, then perhaps we wouldn't have considered doing something so foolish. As we approached the major block of fog, we began seeing smaller wafts of fog rising off the ocean. It was really very eerie. The fog got thicker and thicker as we got more into the fog bank. Soon, we couldn't really see anything that well. We turned out all the lights, except for, of course, the starboard and port navigation lights, which don't turn off. It was drunken stupidity, but it was pretty cool too. It did end up getting a little less cool, however, when we got lost in that fog. I mean, I had my GPS, so I wouldn't be lost out on the ocean, but that didn't tell me how big the fog was and what we had to do in order to get out of it. As more time passed, even though we were still clearly intoxicated, the coolness of our expedition gave way to some nervousness. We tried turning some lights back on at one point, but if you know anything about fog, that doesn't help too much. After a while, we saw something in the fog. It was hard to make out, but there was definitely something there. I immediately thought that another boat was out there too, so I decided I should go and ring my foghorn. I went and did this several times to warn the other ship that I was there in case it didn't see me. I waited to see if I would get a response, but I didn't. So I blew the horn again in case they didn't hear us. After trying this for a few times and not getting any sound or any response at all, we thought about the possibility of the ship being adrift. We really thought about taking a closer look, but we were not drunk enough that we didn't consider the dangers of getting too close to an adrift boat. So we did our best to keep our distance, but tried to get close enough that we could hopefully see something. When we were passing the boat, one of my drunk buddies decided he wanted to try something stupid. He went into the cabin and came back with a golf ball. We had played golf before our trip. I knew what he was going to do immediately and tried to stop him. However, it didn't work as he took the golf ball and hurled it at the other boat. We all heard the clanging noise as the ball hit the hull. And then, lights came on in the boat. After moments, 3 men came onto the deck, all holding guns, and they aimed right at us. We needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. A few shots rang out, though, before I was able to get into the controls and pick things up. I thought we were going to get away easy since my boat was obviously much newer and a faster model than what they had. Plus, I really doubted they would come after us, but I was wrong. They did try to come after us. All I could figure to do at that point was to try to use the fog to our advantage. I turned the lights back out. It was dangerous navigating like before, but even more dangerous now that I was going much faster. But I had to do what I had to do, because I was convinced that those 3 men wanted to kill us. After about an hour, I was positive that we had lost them. However, I was too terrified to turn the lights back on right away. When I eventually did, I was very scared until we were able to get out of the fog. Sometimes something that might seem adventurous is just plain dumb. Me and my girlfriend at the time were traveling from New Zealand to my family back home in Sweden. We both decided to spend a bit more money to fly back through Paris instead of Amsterdam, just because we wanted to see the Eiffel Tower. It ended up costing us maybe an extra $50, and we got to see it on the landing and then take off, but never actually set foot in Paris proper because we were poor students. When we landed in Auckland, New Zealand, jet-lagged to shit, we turned on our phones and noticed that we have about 50 missed calls from our travel agent, which was odd. When we call her back, she sounds super relieved and out of breath. She tells us the flight she originally suggested to us, the one from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, was shot down over Ukraine. My brain couldn't process that information at the time, but once I woke up the next day, it hit me like a ton of bricks. $50 made the difference between seeing the big steel thingy that has so many photos of it and being sent to Sweden in body bags piece by piece. Sometimes the absurdity of my existence comes over me, and this story always gives me goosebumps. One hell of a story to tell over beers, though. I almost got run over by a teenage girl while walking back to my house a few years ago. Actually, it was pretty stupid of me. I watched her before she pulled out into traffic. I had seen that she barely checked her left-hand side, and I knew she couldn't have seen me walking. I should have known better, but I decided that I had enough time to get by her. I get about halfway behind her SUV and she floors it. Well, maybe she didn't floor it, but she definitely did not back out slowly. I had to brace myself against her back windshield and sprint my way around the car as she backed into the street. I don't know how I didn't end up under the car, to be honest. She caught up with me a few blocks later and apologized profusely. She was fairly shook. I was pretty shook up as well and a little angry. I told her that it was alright, but to just be a little more careful next time. In the end, I like to think it made her a much safer driver, since it seemed like she had just gotten her license. It made me a smarter driver and pedestrian as well. I always check and double check before I pull out anywhere anymore, and when I'm walking, I'm much more aware of what cars are doing around me. This was definitely my closest call, though. Every day I walk home from school with my friend because she lives only a little bit away from me, so our routes line up. At the start of the school year, we noticed there was a man usually looking at us from his window while we walked home from school. We found it a little weird, but ultimately didn't think much of it. A few months ago, after the heat of summer died down a bit, he started sitting out on his porch when we were walking by. Usually he would just smile at us. Sometimes I smiled back, but I usually just ignored him. One day, as I was walking by his house, he waved to me from where he was sitting. I stopped and waved back at him and told him to have a nice afternoon as I walked past. It felt a little weird because he didn't reply, but eventually I forgot about the whole thing. Once my mother was at work and I was alone at our house, I noticed him walking past my house several times through my window. I felt very creeped out and uncomfortable from it. I considered talking to my parents about it just in case, but I ultimately convinced myself he wasn't doing anything wrong, so it didn't really matter. Yesterday, I walked home from school alone because I stayed behind with some other kids outside the school for a few hours since we had art club that day, and I didn't want to walk home just to have to come back fairly soon after. I had just bought myself a nice pair of wired headphones a few weeks ago with the money I'd been saving up for a long time since I don't have a job. I was playing them over one ear as I was walking home. On the way home, there is a public lot with a stable on it that I like to cut through to get into my yard as quick as I can, rather than walking around the property. Sometimes people like to hang around it to meet up, but there wasn't anyone that I could see this time. As I rounded a corner on the stables, someone grabbed the back of my shirt. From the way they were grabbing it, I could see part of their hand. I jerked forward and they grabbed the top part of my headphones. The wire was at the bottom part of my neck and it got stuck for a moment. I remember feeling like if I couldn't get away now, something very bad was going to happen. The wire eventually snapped and I took off running as fast as I could, screaming. They let go of my shirt and I hopped the half-length fence to our property. I ran as fast as I could out onto the sidewalk in front of my house because I was worried that I would take too long on the lock if they were following me. By the time I actually got to the sidewalk point, I was crying and I felt like I was going to collapse because I was so scared. When I looked over my shoulder, I couldn't see anyone, but I kept running until I reached my friend's house in case whoever was there was still around. When I got there, I was in tears, and it took a bit to explain the situation because they couldn't understand me. They tried calling my mother, but she wouldn't pick up the phone. My friend's mom called the police and they came to check things out. There was nobody at the stables, and they told me that it was most likely some kid trying to mess around with me, but they escorted me home to where my mother was, waiting for me always. I didn't tell them about the old man because I was worried they would think I was crazy, considering he hadn't technically done anything, but there's something in my mind that keeps telling me that it was him who grabbed me at the stables. When I was walking home from school today, I brought a screwdriver with me in case I needed to defend myself. I also had my friend with me. My mother offered to pick me up from school, but I was worried that if I had shown how the encounter had affected me, then it would make things worse. I also made sure to avoid the stables from then on, and my friend made sure I made it to the door. The guy on his porch wasn't there today, and I'm still not fully sure if it was him or not. I feel terrible that my headphones broke, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if they didn't. This actually just happened about half an hour ago. I came back to my hometown for the holidays, as it's a fairly rural area with woods and everything is peaceful. I love going to pick wild berries, and I was doing just that when I encountered the first paranormal experience of my entire life. It happened in the backyard of my neighbor's house. Here are a few details so that the story makes more sense. I used to have an old man as a neighbor who lived alone. He was a very kind person. He used to give us those berries as candied sweets. He passed away due to cardiac failure when I was in high school, and his house has been empty ever since. I wanted to make those sweets for my family as a holiday comfort food and thus went back to his place. Now, as he passed a few years ago, there was a lot of undergrowth and wild grass in his yard and everything was messy. I cleared some of the growth and made way to the shrubs, cleaning the place as much as I could. I was thinking about how clean he used to keep everything. All this time I had a feeling that something was off, and that I was being watched, but I brushed it off. I was 2 minutes into picking when I heard my neighbor's voice. I'm sure it was him, saying I should be more careful and to pick up the rake immediately. It was as if I was fainting. Everything was fast or slow, and I can't really explain that. But as soon as I picked up the rake, some homeless man tried to stab me with a knife. I used the sharp end of the rake to scare him off and kept shouting loudly. Eventually, he did run off. After I gathered myself, I had tears, but couldn't shake off a smile I had. It was eerie. I think I'm going to clean my neighbor's place. I owe him that much. My story happened quite a while back in North California. I'm now 21. So when I was about 6 or 7, I had a best friend from church. I completely envied her as a child, her clothes, lip gloss, dolls, the whole 9 yards. Anyway, we always played together after church because our dads were also best friends. The thing is, when little girls are best pals, they always want to have sleepovers. It's the thing to do. So, being that we were just the stereotypical girls, my friend would always beg me to spend the night after church so we could hang out. My mom, being the typical overprotective person that she is, always said no. Even with threats of tears and whines, I never got to stay. Years later, I moved away but went back to visit for a wedding. We're now 14 or so, and tried our luck again at persuading my parents to let me spend the night, and to our amazement, my mother actually said yes. Years later, my dad gets an emergency call and we travel back to that same town. It turns out that her dad had been molesting her since she was about 5 years old, as well as her cousins and extended family that would spend the night. My mom freaks out and asks me if anything happened. Luckily, nothing ever did, but I felt like this was a pretty close call. This might be a little on the long side, but I can't explain what happened rationally. It's worth a read. I'm not a spiritual person, nor do I believe in the paranormal, but 3 weeks ago my cat died in my arms. Our bond was remarkable. I had found him as a kitten, and he was crossing a dangerous country road, so I stopped, opened my door, and he just jumped into my lap and curled up there. I was his. I'm an animal lover, and I've had special pets, but Solomon was almost like a familiar to me. We even had our own special language. The week he died, he went missing on a Monday. I knew something bad had happened because he always came to me when I called to him. I searched every square inch of my house, the woods and land around the house, and each neighbor's property for days. I even arranged to bring in search dogs. I'm telling you, if he was out there, I would have found him. I was devastated. Then, Wednesday came around, and by this time, most of the friends and family members helping me search were exhausted and losing hope. I can't lie, I was too. At dusk, I prepared to turn it in. My body ached and my spirit was broken, but I was just so damn restless. So setting out solo for the first time, I leashed up my dog and decided to walk the property one last time. And that's when he found me. I was losing light when I had spotted him out of the corner of my eye, sitting on the bank opposite the creek, a place I had already searched a dozen times. I called to him, and he looked toward me, almost as if he was searching my face to make sure it was really me before responding, and then he literally bolted towards the house. Something was strange about this interaction, but we'll come back to that at the end. So I ran back up to the house and went down to the spot where I had seen him, and searched all around the woods with the light I had left. The entire time, though, I felt pulled toward the cellar, another place I had also searched many times. And in the cellar he was. I knew it as soon as I started down the steps. He answered my calls this time, the way he always had. But he was not right. He couldn't move. It turns out he threw a saddle thrombus, or a massive blood clot, cutting off all circulation to his hind legs and tail. Solomon could not walk, let alone make a sprint across acres to make it from his spot by the bank to the cellar in just a few minutes between these two encounters. He purred from the moment I picked him up until the very second he threw major clots to his lungs and brain 3 hours later. He died in my arms. My Solomon found me in the beginning, and he found me again at the very end. I cannot explain what I saw or how it happened when I spotted him by that creek. I found it almost impossible to focus on his face, almost as if I was looking at a poor quality recording of him. And even more significantly, his eyes were completely black, not cloudy, his most distinguishing feature. Even the vet agrees that there was no way that it could have been physically possible for him to have run from the spot I saw him. I don't understand what this experience was, but I'm starting to believe that he found a way to come back to me as the end was nearing. I will never forget this moment. I miss you, Solomon. This happened in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, within a few days actually, and was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. The fact that me and my sister are still alive today and with our family is amazing. My sister and I were throwing a baseball in the front yard when my sister threw it badly and I had to go chase after it. Well, where I was going to get the ball, I could still see her, but a truck pulled up and I'm assuming couldn't see me. Then a man jumped out, grabbed my sister, and jumped back into the truck. Unbeknownst to me, my dad also saw, but I took off running after the truck too. I was only 15 at the time, but I played many sports and was quite athletic, and for whatever reason the truck stopped at the end of the street just long enough for me to reach it and open the door. I grabbed my sister who was fighting with the man in the front seat, but in the process of pulling on her, I pull him out too and we start fighting. I tell my sister to run and she does, but I can't get away from the man myself. The driver walks around and tells me I've made a huge mistake and points a gun right in my face. All of a sudden I hear my dad bellow, "Drop it or I'll kill you both," with his shotgun aimed at the guy's chest. The guy I'm wrestling with lets go and jumps in the truck, but the other guy was not so lucky. He rounded the truck with the gun still in his hand and my dad shot. My dad says he barely nicked him just to get the point across, but the man screamed, dropped the gun, jumped in the truck and took off. As he drove off, Dad shot the truck so cops could identify it easier. There was a significant amount of blood where the guy had been shot. Also, just to give you an idea of what things are like when the government is broken, we called the cops, and after hearing that we were okay, they told us sorry, but they had bigger things to deal with. This happened a few years ago. It was pretty late, past 1:30 or 2 a.m. I was living with this boy who was pretty abusive, and he had gotten really jealous at this party we were at earlier that night. Not even an hour after we had gotten home, he tossed me out onto the front porch and locked the door behind me. I was knocking and pleading for him to please let me back inside. I was still wearing what I had worn to the party and I was freezing out. I wasn't sure what to do. He had my phone, purse, and wallet in the house with him, so I just sat on the porch crying. When he turned off the lights both inside and outside of the house, I knew he wasn't going to let me back in. I felt so helpless and cold. I thought about knocking on a neighbor's door, though he didn't really have many, but I had anxiety about waking any of them up and causing trouble for my boyfriend. So instead, I decided I would try to walk to this gas station and motel that were nearby, so I could use their phone to try and call a girlfriend of mine to see if I could sleep over with her. Ironically enough, the road I was walking on was Donner Pass Road, so the freezing cold was fitting. But anyway, a little bit into the walk, this tall white pickup truck was approaching on the opposite side of the road that I was on. I tried my best not to make eye contact for obvious reasons, but then I heard the truck stopping and beginning to make a U-turn, and my heart just started pounding. I just about froze up, but forced myself to speed walk at the very least. The truck pulled up to me and this guy rolled down the window and asked what I was doing out this late. I told him how I was going to meet a friend at the gas station and that she was expecting me. He sort of smiled and offered me a ride. I said no thank you, citing that I shouldn't hitchhike. He then told me, well good, I don't pick up hitchhikers or anyone. You don't look like a hitchhiker though, you just look like you need some help. He just kept driving next to me and told me I shouldn't think he was a creep. He pulled out what looked like a police badge and told me he had just gotten off duty, which is why he was in civilian clothes and out so late. He said he wouldn't mind driving next to me just to make sure I get to where I was heading safely. I was naive and a bit too trusting of his kindness and credentials, and when he offered me a ride again, I said that it would be nice because the gas station wasn't that far away anyway. He popped the door open for me and I hopped in. The radio was low, it was a little messy, the ashtray was full of cigarettes. There were a lot of newspapers on the passenger floor, and as I was moving my feet, some of the papers shifted, showing a pair of handcuffs, some coffee cups, empty water bottles, rags, a highlight-colored bandana, and some other things. He apologized, saying that his truck looked like he was hunting, but it was super warm, so I was just happy and didn't mind at all. He told me his name was John. He then asked why I was scantily dressed without a jacket, and I started to tell him about the party and the fight I had been in with my boyfriend. He was super charming and attentive. He even laughed that he could go back and arrest him for me. I then asked about him, and he told me about his family. He was a young dad. He had a wife, a daughter, a son, and a dog, and I told him it was like he had the perfect little family, and he laughed and said he certainly did. Then, it sort of clicked for me that I asked if I could use his phone, but he said no because he had to save his battery. After just a little while, we were approaching the gas station, and he drove right past it. I politely said, "Oh, I think that's the one," but he didn't answer me. At that point, I felt sick to my stomach. My heart started pounding, I started getting choked up, and my eyes started tearing up as I looked outside the windows and watched the lights behind us getting further and further away. It was getting hard for me to even speak, but somehow I murmured, asking if he could please turn around, and he just ignored me. Whenever I looked at him, he just looked empty-eyed and emotionless, totally dead and glazed. I looked back out the window and down at the road to see if maybe we were getting slow enough that I could make a leap out of the car without seriously injuring myself. I remember always hearing in my head, never go to the second location, but I thought about the possibility of jumping out and breaking an ankle and how it would be a lot harder to get away with one foot as opposed to two, debating with myself that there was snow on the ground, but then again, snow is hard to get along in, especially when you're not fully clothed. I feel so dumb now too, because I wasn't even tied up or anything. I was just so scared. Like there was nothing but trees, an empty road, and us. I was crying pretty badly at this point, and I asked if I could please borrow his phone again. I don't know why I even asked. He simply told me to stop talking. Then he started talking underneath his breath. Girls shouldn't be out so late. You shouldn't have been alone this late. Look what you're doing to me, dressed like a slut, and other derogatory things. As he kept saying these terrible things, I wasn't even responding. I was just crying and trying to think past the fear I was feeling. I then remember the pair of handcuffs I remember seeing under the papers beneath my feet, so I used the little scoopy motion to try and get my feet around them. I managed to use my feet to scoop up the handcuffs and my heels and toes to push them underneath the bottom of my seat as far as I could. I was thinking of different things I could try to do to help myself, like if we were close enough to some upcoming lights or structures, I could just grab the wheel and cause us to crash into them. Or maybe how if I got lucky enough for a cop to pass us, I could grab the wheel and swerve so he would appear to be a drunk driver and we'd possibly get pulled over. I guiltily thought about the possibility if this man is just having a weird night and how if I did anything it would hurt him. But again, I told myself that sort of thinking sort of got me into this mess to begin with. He pulled off-road where there were still woods on both sides of us. On his side, the wooded trees were closer to the road, and on mine, there was a small gap fully covered in thick before the trees thickly picked up maybe 10 to 16 feet away. He turned off the car and coldly said that there was something wrong with the car and to get out with him. As he grabbed the keys and was stepping out of the car, I grabbed onto the center console and cried and pleaded not to make me get out with him because it was too cold. He turned around to face me, his door still open, and shouted at me to get out of the car because we had to go check out the trunk bed hatch. I dug my fingernails deeper into the console, thinking my cries of no and head shaking would cause him to come around to my side of the car and drag me out himself. I was crying and said, "Please, John, I'm so cold and scared." I was thinking of everything I ever heard. Humanize yourself. Use first names. He simply stared at me in this way I can't even describe to this day. I don't even know how to start. He got back in the car and I slinked towards my window, scared he would drag me over the console. He turned off the headlights and everything just looked dark blue. He stared at the steering wheel for what felt like years before lighting a cigarette and looking out of his window and back at me and then back out his window. He heard me shuffle my feet on the newspapers. I was just adjusting my legs at this point, but while still staring out of his window, told me if I thought about running, he had a quick way to get me where he wanted me. And oddly enough, I was sort of thinking of running minutes before that, but reasoned that if he wanted me out of the car, then I should definitely stay in. Otherwise, he could chase me or shoot me. I'm glad I was right. I think at that point, I sort of hit some sort of bottom of my reverse, and instead of panic, there was numbness and exhaustion. There was still an occasional hot tear or two, but I just remember being numb. I've talked to a psychiatrist about this sort of feeling before, and he thinks it just comes from my ex-boyfriends giving me PTSD. It was dead quiet, but I finally just barely audibly told him that my friend was still waiting for me and asked about his wife and children, and he flatly said he didn't have a wife or children and that his house was empty. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he said, "I'm thinking about what to do with you." He didn't say it angrily, he just said it flatly and coldly, which sort of scared me more. I did start getting worked up back to a cry, and at that point he told me not to cry and turned the car on, offering me some heat. I just cried and said I wanted to go home. Eventually, he started driving again, and kept driving until we were approaching a gas station. I was gauging the right time to reach to the wheel, but before I could, he started slowing down. While pulling up, he told me not to tell anyone or he would find me. Then he told me all he was doing was teaching me a lesson not to hitchhike with strangers. He was almost coming to a complete stop when he told me to get out of the car before he changes his mind. Before he could even get another look at me to assess my understanding, I was already down out of the truck and sprinting towards the gas station. The panic was overwhelming me, but then I stopped and I remembered to try to see his license plate. I turned around but only caught a blur of the last 3 numbers as he was driving off. I ran inside and asked the clerk behind the counter to please call the police. I waited until the officer got there, and I'll be honest, I was a little scared it would be John. My fears then melted away though when the new-faced policeman got there. I gave him the description of John, his appearance, the vehicle color and type, the parts of the license plate number I had caught, and the fact that he said he was an off-duty cop. Just basically anything I could. I asked him if he could look at the camera, and the officer disappeared in the back for a little bit, but then came back out saying there was nothing on them. I asked if I was able to look, and the officer said no, and asked me if I didn't trust him, and told him of course I did. The officer gave me a ride to my friend's, lecturing me for hitchhiking, consisting of him repeatedly asking me if I knew who Ted Bundy was. Of course I knew. I was just naive to think it could ever happen to me, and I was desperate for some warmth. I never heard anything back about the report that was made. They never came back to me aside from this one time I was told my case number didn't exist, but that didn't stop me from trying to follow up. Throughout the coming months and years, I asked my friend, the one whose house I ended up sleeping over at that night, if she had ever heard of any like weirdness or anything since that incident had happened to her or anyone up there, and she always says no. So I sort of let it go and tried to tell myself that maybe he actually was just trying to teach me a lesson or something. I mean, I definitely never hitchhiked again, so if it was a lesson, it certainly worked. I never heard anything back having to do with the case, and I never heard of any odd experiences up there again. Maybe it was just one man trying to teach me something. But honestly, sometimes I think I tell myself all of that to help me sleep better at night. It all felt really real. Even if it wasn't real, I'm really glad I didn't get out of the car in the woods that night. I was on a barquentine sailing vessel a few years back off the coast of Puerto Rico in the middle of a nasty storm. We were dousing our sails when things began to look calm for a second. People were going to rack out when we suddenly heard a meaty smack against the side of the ship. Somebody had fallen from the rigging and hit their leg on the gunwale, and then into the water they went. Swells were only 5 to 7 feet, but well enough to conceal a man overboard. The night was also pitch black, except for on occasion there was this bright blue lightning. Every few minutes it would give just enough illumination to see past the rain and wind. It was so hard to see where this guy was, even with the binoculars, man overboard modules, or whatever else we could throw that floats and lights up. An emergency small boat was sent out to bring him in, but couldn't find him either. As 12 minutes had passed without laying eyes on him, it wasn't looking good. Just a split second later, the lightning gives off the biggest spark and crack of thunder all night. The whole area was lit like a floodlight, with the light that shined above us, and there was our missing man. When the light was gone, the boat and the man overboard called out to each other. He got out of the water safely. I don't know if this incident qualifies as supernatural or divine intervention, but without that final burst of lightning, we would have never found our man out there. The night could have ended a lot grimmer, but he left that disaster with only a broken femur. Still, I think it's amazing the man tread water with a broken leg for 12 minutes in the middle of a storm. I'll never forget that. For as long as I've known my wife, she's mentioned growing up in a haunted house. I always assumed she was joking because she always brought it up in quite a lighthearted way and never went into much detail. It was a big old house, and I figured she was talking about weird old house noises. The house belonged to her great aunt, who raised my wife for most of her childhood. Her great aunt recently passed away, and her great aunt's daughter, who my wife calls her aunt, though technically she's her second cousin or something, now owns the house. After my wife's great aunt passed, we went to stay in the house for 4 nights to attend the funeral and spend time with my wife's family, as we live in another state. When we got there, my wife and her aunt were chatting and mentioned that they had thought my wife's great aunt might join the ghosts already haunting the house. I still didn't consider that they might be serious. The first night we spent there, I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed someone standing in the corner of the room beside the door. Thinking it was my wife, I asked what she was doing. This woke up my wife, who was actually sleeping beside me. I said I thought I saw someone in the room with us, but it must just be my eyes playing tricks on me. She said, "The person in the corner next to the door? Yeah, don't worry about it." I almost pissed myself. I thought there was some creep in the room and my wife was too sleepy to process it. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but when my phone lit up the room, I saw there was no one there. There wasn't even a weird shape that I might have mistaken for a person. The door was closed, so it wasn't like there could have been someone there who left the room in the moments I was looking away to grab my phone. My wife told me it was common to see shadowy people in the night, but I shouldn't worry because they don't do anything. She fell back asleep right after that, but I just lay there awake the whole night, wondering what the hell had just happened. The next morning I asked my wife about it, and she said she wasn't kidding about the house being haunted. People who spend the night in the house regularly see and hear ghosts, but they've never hurt anyone or caused any problems. I remained skeptical even after the next night, which had been after the funeral, and my wife and her aunt both reported they had been visited in their dreams by my wife's great aunt. So far, in my mind, everything was weird but explainable. The figure in the room could have been a strange trick of the light. My wife and her aunt had just attended the funeral of a loved one, and it made sense for both of them to dream about her that night. The third night, I was kept awake for hours by the constant sound of footsteps pacing around the house. My wife also heard them, but said it was normal and I shouldn't worry, and she fell asleep easily. A few times during the night, I got up to look around for the source of the noise. I even did a couple of laps of the outside of the house in case there was someone outside. I never saw anyone walking around. At one point, I was in the lounge room and heard footsteps from the kitchen. I called out to ask if there was anyone there. My wife's aunt opened her bedroom door and said she could hear the footsteps too, and just like my wife, she told me it was normal and that there was no cause for concern. Then, there was the sound of a drawer opening in the kitchen, which we both reacted to, and I went to check out and found the cutlery drawer open. My wife's aunt, who had come to the kitchen too, simply closed the drawer, commented with mild annoyance that the ghosts are always leaving things open, and went back to bed, leaving me to my existential crisis. I could not come up with a way to explain that away. We both heard the footsteps, both heard the drawer open at the same time, and there was no one there and no way out of the kitchen except for past us. I tried staying on the couch to try and catch the mystery walker, and there were multiple times I heard the footsteps pass through the lounge room, but I never saw anything. Eventually I gave up and went back to bed. Nothing really happened the final night, though we woke up to several cabinets open and no one remembering leaving them open. Though that could have been explainable by someone just forgetting or even sleepwalking. Even so, the footsteps still bothered me, and the shadowy person from the first night and cabinets open on the final night made me nervous in light of everything that happened on the third night. Up until now, I've always scoffed at the idea of the paranormal, but I just can't reconcile my experiences in that house with my skepticism. Talking to my wife's family revealed that everyone who stayed in the house believes it's haunted, because they've had at least one completely unexplainable experience there. They all report that the ghosts leave people alone for the most part, though some who have lived there for a long time as children, including my wife and her aunt, have described meeting people they thought were probably ghosts and having positive but strange interactions with them. Here's a little background to the story. When I was in 6th grade, I was unfortunate enough to get Burkitt's lymphoma. Chemo is the usual treatment, and along with that, part of the chemo is to get spinal taps to protect and test the spinal cord. It's important to note that I was also a freakishly large 6th grader and just under 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds. So the events went down like this. On a particular spinal tap, I was resisting the anesthesia they had given me. I attribute this to me being huge, and the children's hospital just not having to deal with kids this large usually. They had to up the dosage. Not a problem. I got knocked out fine, and the procedure went as planned. Fast forward to the next time I needed to get one. Before they put me under, the doctor had mentioned that it was her first time doing one solo, and that she was really excited. Uh-oh. She read my chart, pumped me full of anesthesia, and did the procedure. The problem is this. When the doctor looked at how much knockout juice they gave me the last time, she looked at the total amount they gave me and gave it to me at once instead of spreading it out over the hour or however long the first tap went. The next thing I remember is being very groggy and just wanting to go back to sleep. But the nurse, doctor, anesthesiologist, and my mom were all trying to get me to stay awake. I was pissed and just wanted to take a nap, but they were having none of it. I found out later that my heart slowed way down. My blood pressure had dropped significantly, and apparently I was about as close to dead as you can get without being dead. The doctor apologized over and over to me and my mother. And that's how I got unlimited ice cream at the hospital. This happened in January of 2019. My stepdad had been in our family's life for 30 years before he was diagnosed with cancer. He never had any biological children, but he had me and my sister, and we couldn't have asked for a better stepdad or granddad for our children. I was with him when he was diagnosed and was with him for all of his treatments too. From the very beginning, there was no question of who would take care of him. It was going to be me. He and my mother were split up at the time, and it just seemed natural that I would be the one to do it because of how close we were. And honestly, I considered it an honor. Unfortunately, his prognosis was not very good, and they gave him less than a year to live. He barely made it 6 months after his diagnosis. He was in the hospital the last 6 days of his life. He had a DNR, and as hard as it was, I didn't argue with him about it. 2 days before he passed, he was in and out of consciousness and was barely able to talk. His last night, he was able to communicate that he really wanted me to go home and check on the dogs. This was just about 3 a.m. I told him that I would do that and that I would be right back. He gave me a small smile and nodded. It took 20 minutes for me to get home, and 10 minutes after walking through the door, the hospital called and said that he had passed. I felt so guilty for leaving until I thought, he knew there was already someone with the dogs, but he insisted that I check in on them. Perhaps he didn't want me there at the time? I don't know. I still don't know. Now, what I do know is the morning after he passed, I had a missed call from his phone that had been in my purse the whole time he was in the hospital. The call was made at 3:47 a.m., and the voicemail that he left said, "Thank you for everything, sweetheart. I love you." That message was left in my stepdad's perfect, loving voice, not the raspy, out-of-breath, strained voice he had moments before he died. Some people have said that it may have been an old message that I had just received that morning, but either way, I thought it was amazing. I was carjacked by a guy who had just robbed an auto store. This was December of 2002. I had just gotten done dropping my then wife off at the airport. She was flying back to California for Christmas. I had stopped by Wendy's on the way back because nothing says woo-woo a week of peace and quiet like 2 junior bacon cheeseburgers. Unknown to me, at about this time, 3 people were robbing an auto parts store in Georgetown, Texas. Georgetown is a small town north of Austin and Round Rock, but still very much a suburb of Austin. These 3 pistol-whipped the clerks, stole their money, and stole a vehicle to get away. They proceeded to go down south on I-35 from Georgetown to Austin. One of the clerks flagged down a passing cop and pointed out the stolen vehicle, so by this time the 3 idiots had 2 cop cars in pursuit of them. Meanwhile, I was moving northbound on the frontage road of I-35. The frontage road was moving much faster than that of the freeway, and I kind of dig riding along the frontage roads anyway. This was also the last Friday before Christmas that year, so I suspected we had a lot more traffic than normal. The suspects hit a traffic jam on southbound, and traffic literally came to a halt. 2 of the suspects jumped out of the car and over the center divider. Multiple officers did the same thing, giving pursuit. One cop shattered his ankle while landing because it was about an 8-foot drop. The third guy gave up in the car. I was about to meet a guy with a gun. About this time, I saw a sheriff's deputy running southbound on the northbound shoulder. Traffic in front of me came to a standstill, and so did I. At this point, I saw the cop stop about 60 feet away and draw his gun. I turned my head to see someone standing at my door. He reaches into his waistband, pulls out a gun, puts it to my head, and says, "Get out of the fucking car." Meanwhile, the deputy is yelling, "Drop the gun, get down," etc. As I was getting out of the car and the carjacker was getting in, he put the gun to the back of my head. Sheriff then fired the first shot. It hit the carjacker in the shoulder and knocked the gun away from my head. They then started exchanging shots with each other. I hit the deck and realized how close I was to the action. So I got back up, ran like hell for the grass, and dropped there. The third guy just kept running all the way to Mexico. He has never been caught. Suspect got hit 3 times. He was hit in the shoulder, head, and through the hand. The shot to the head entered the front of his head and went around the outside of the skull and exited the back of his head. It didn't pierce his skull at all. And for a little bit of karma justice, he additionally got shrapnel from my dashboard in his stomach as it exploded from the gunfire. I survived with just glass in my head and a new lease on life. Here is a picture of the car after the incident. To answer the most common questions, I only had liability, so had to pay for damage myself. In theory, I may have been able to get some compensation from the city or victims' assistance, but quite honestly was just happy to be alive. Here are some comments on did the officer put my life in danger by firing a shot first. I don't know what was happening behind me. I didn't see it. I've come to know the officer very well since the incident and do not in any way believe he would have fired had he not thought his life or mine was in immediate danger. I believe to this day that if he hadn't fired the shot, I would be dead now, and truthfully, it doesn't matter, because I lived. It's not about what I saw, but about what I heard. I was on a 688I second flight class boat for part of my career in the US Navy. We were heading from Hawaii to Japan and moving fast, so you tend not to see a whole lot on a sonar because of flow noise unless you're close. SAWS, or Situational Awareness Systems, reported a transient sound and said it was weird, but there was no trace on the screen, so it wasn't a distant source. It was all around us. I switched my station over to broadband, so I could see and hear what SAWS was saying and hearing, and started listening. Sure enough, I heard it too. It was a sound like crystal bells ringing with no defined source, except I had more sensors at my disposal because I could flip through any configuration. The sounds, whatever they were deeper than we were, and were all around us by the end of it. I still don't know what it was, but we always called them the Deep Ones in reference to Cthulhu. It was the type of thing that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up to listen to, though. I was in one of the deadliest hunter-killers powered by a nuclear reactor, and that kind of sound made you imagine something much bigger out there in the depths. This was really the creepiest thing I have ever had happen to me in my entire life. I come from a really long line of ocean fishermen, and of course, with overfishing, it gets harder and harder all the time to really make a great living off of this. Yearly, it seems like I have to go further and further out into the ocean in order to get anything I can actually sell. It's definitely difficult having a smaller boat and competing with larger commercial boats, but I really love the life, and I'm not really willing to change my livelihood just because it gets more difficult. Anyway, I did have this really bizarre experience once when I was out fishing. We had been out for a couple of days and not doing the best job. We went out further and further. On the third night, we had gone out pretty far on the ocean. We hadn't seen any other boats or ships in quite a while, which I hoped was a good thing. Maybe we'd get lucky and be able to farm the area that wasn't getting too much attention from other ships. As night fell, the ocean was really, really calm. I was getting ready to get a little sleep when one of my shipmates came into the cabin and told me that there was a ship out ahead of us. It was coming right in our direction. Now, I wasn't really exactly sure why he felt the need to tell me this. Being out on a boat in the ocean isn't like being in a movie. We weren't really in any danger of being hit by the ship. We'd just move out of the way. But he insisted that I had to see the ship. I ended up going out on deck, and when I did, I understood immediately why he wanted me to come out and look. The ship was a cruise ship, but it wasn't like any cruise ship that would still be in service. The ship looked like it had to be at least 60 or 70 years out of date. There were no lights either. If we hadn't had a full moon, we would have had a much more difficult time seeing it in the first place. I was curious at this point. We tried to contact them on radio, but we weren't getting any response. We weren't in a direct line of the ship, but I definitely wanted to see the ship as it passed by, so we got as close as we could get safely to the ship. When I got closer, I noticed it was obviously adrift, so we had to be extra careful. When the ship was pretty close to us, it was quite overwhelming. It was so large, but it was ominous and dark and dead. There were no lights on it, and this was obviously a ghost ship. Keeping in mind that I am not referring to an actual ghost ship. I meant that the ship was abandoned, and who knew how long it could have been adrift. If you've ever been in a small boat next to a huge ship, it would be hard for you to imagine what it was like. It was ominous, and completely and utterly dwarfed our boat. If we had gotten too close to it, it would have easily destroyed us. We were like mice at the feet of a giant. "Holy shit," one of my friends said to me. I looked over at him and he pointed at the ship's deck. I was shocked to see someone on deck. A very young man, looked like he was in his early 20s. He was leaning over the rail looking at us. As we went along, he simply looked at us as we floated past. I tried calling out to the guy, but I got no response. He just stood there, looking down at us. We turned around to get another look at him when we passed by, but he wasn't there the second time. We eventually went on after this amazing spectacle, but it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. We reported this all to the Coast Guard, but I honestly think that they thought it was a prank. I can't blame them. I would have thought it was a prank too. Last December, I was visiting my family down in Florida, and we spent some time in Treasure Island. My brother and I took my dog down to the beach at about 2 a.m. to play some fetch, drink, and have a good time. If you walk along the water, you can reach a few restaurants, bars, and hotels lined along the beach. Out of nowhere, we see someone walking pretty quickly in our direction from over there, and a few moments later we can make out that they're being followed. My dog is arguably pretty well trained. We work search and rescue, and I've never once had her run off without permission, and never once has she not instantly returned when called. But that changed that night. She was about 5 feet from me, and I saw her hackles shoot up and went to grab her collar, but she took off in a full sprint, making some truly terrifying barking and growling sounds. We obviously took off after her, and she reached the first person and stopped between them and the people behind them. She was barking and growling and lunging, and I finally caught up and put her on a leash. She's never reacted in that manner, so it was pretty scary. The group following her ended up being 3 men that were probably in their early 30s. They started booking it in the other direction. I turned around and the person being followed was a young woman around my age. We asked if she was okay, and she just broke down in tears and collapsed into my brother. My dog insisted that she get on the ground for some excited pup kisses and a soaking wet cuddle, which they both seemed to enjoy. She was far too overwhelmed to talk, so she got us into her phone and rang her friend's number to have us talk to her. We were able to figure out where she was staying and walk her back to her hotel, where she met up with her friends, and we all exchanged numbers to talk at a later time. The next day we all got together, where we learned she had gone out for a walk on the beach, stopped for a drink at a bar, drank a bit, and then soon wasn't feeling right. So she left the bar and noticed 3 men left after her. She had been walking for about a mile at that point, terrified and slowly getting more and more fucked up. She doesn't remember much about the night, and we knew she was probably on something, but we had no clue she had been drugged. We're still friends now, and we're all going to meet up for spring break when we're all back in Florida. I've never been more proud of my dog and more grateful that we were in the right place at the right time. I hate thinking about what could have happened. To those 3 men, though, let's never meet. One February day 10 years ago, a younger and much nerdier version of me was walking home from school together with a few classmates. The temperature had been around 0 degrees Celsius for the last week, some days above, resulting in thawing of the still thick layer of snow, and some days right below, refreezing the water, creating extremely slippery roads. As we were walking uphill, happy that school was over for the day, some of the cooler kids started to throw snowballs at each other. Suddenly, they decided to all gang up on the smallest amongst the group, me. As the snowballs flew towards me through the air, I flinched and took a step backwards, slipped on a spot of ice, and fell out onto the road. As I spun around 180 degrees in midair, I could see an old Volvo just a few meters away from me, heading in my direction, downhill, on an icy road. As I fall on my stomach and close my eyes in fear of what I think is my certain death, I can hear the brakes screeching and my classmates screaming, and suddenly I feel something bump into my backpack and pushes it a foot downhill. After a moment of complete silence, me thinking I was dead, I finally realize I wasn't, and I dared to open my eyes. All I see is the dark rubber of a wheel inches away from my face. My backpack, or rather the amount of school books that were in my backpack, that saved me from getting hit by the front of the car with enough force to push me to safety, leaving my head intact. Without those extra 5 inches on my back, my brain would have ended up as a puddle of red jello on the road. And thanks to the old man in the car slowing down to 5 miles per hour when passing playing school children, while also being fast enough on the brakes and having put on brand new winter tires for the season. Do your homework, kids. It might save your life. When I was 19, my best friend was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. We knew her cancer was terminal and she had a life expectancy of 5 years at most. Her and I would talk every now and then about passing on, and how even though I was healthy, I could always go before her in a car crash or some other way. We made a pact that no matter which one of us left first, we would come back to the other and let them know that there was more to life after death. She eventually passed away from her illness at 22 years old, leaving behind her husband and her 3-year-old son. She passed away on a Sunday at 8:20 a.m. I remember the call from her husband vividly. He asked me to bring her son to the hospital because she had passed away. That day was a complete blur. I couldn't find myself to come to the reality she was no longer with us. It all felt so unreal. We were allowed to be with her for a few hours in her hospital room before she was taken away. But while we were in there with her, I don't know, I was in a complete shock and my mind just couldn't process it. I didn't cry. Leaving the hospital was so strange, because at the time I had no children and my life revolved around my work, my home, and her. She lived a few minutes away from my job at the time, so I would always leave work very early to see her, whether she was at home or at the hospital. I loved her so much. I could never be away from her. So now knowing I had to go home and trying to process I would never see her again just threw my life for a spin. That night I couldn't sleep. I just kept trying to make sense of it all. In all honesty, I don't even remember the thoughts that were going through my head, but the feelings of loss and confusion were very prevalent in me. But at around 3 a.m, I felt the most beautiful and reassuring feeling I had ever felt in my life. I felt what I can only describe as a warm hug take over me from my head to my toe, and I fell asleep almost instantly. That night I had a dream. In my dream, I called her husband to let him know that she had written me a letter. He then tells me that it's funny because she left him a voicemail. He then asks me to read him the letter, so I read it to him. In this letter, she tells us how thankful she is that we were in her life. She thanked us for taking care of her and loving her. She asks us to please watch over her son, and that she is okay, and is no longer in pain. She also tells us that we will be okay. As I finish telling him about the letter, my mom comes into the room and wakes me up. She asks me for a pen and paper. I hand her a piece of paper I had, and she starts to write. When she finishes, she hands it to me, saying she didn't know why, but something told her to write this and give it to me. When I read the letter, it was word for word what my best friend told me in my dream, and she signed it with her father's last name. Now, my mom only knew her by her mother's last name. No one outside her close relatives and myself knew her father's last name, so I was very confused as to how she signed it with her father's last name. I asked why or how she wrote this. My mom didn't know, she just wrote. I explained to her about my dream, and she was as surprised as I was. I immediately called her husband and told him about the letter and my dream, and he agreed they were all her words. My best friend came through with her promise. This made me a believer. I know there's more after death.